The morning sun cast long shadows across the military base as Sergeant Marcus Thompson adjusted his dress uniform one final time. His hands trembled slightly, not from nervousness, but from the weight of responsibility that pressed down on his shoulders. Today, he would escort home Staff Sergeant David Martinez, a fallen hero who had given his life serving his country in Afghanistan. The flag-draped casket sat solemnly in the transport vehicle, and Marcus knew that every mile of this journey would be sacred. David Martinez had been more than just another soldier. He was a father of 2 young children, a devoted husband, and a man who believed deeply in protecting the freedoms that so many took for granted. When the improvised explosive device claimed his life during a routine patrol, it sent shockwaves through his unit and his community back home in Nebraska. Now, 3 days later, Marcus had volunteered for the honor of bringing David home to his family. The military escort protocol was precise and dignified. Marcus would accompany the casket on a commercial flight, ensuring that David's remains were treated with the utmost respect throughout the journey. He had done this duty before, but each time felt like the first. The responsibility never got easier, and the emotions never dulled. As he checked his paperwork one final time, Marcus thought about David's wife, Sarah, and their children, Emma and Jake, who were waiting at home for their father's return. The drive to the airport was quiet, with the hearse moving at a respectful pace through the early morning traffic. Marcus sat in the passenger seat, his eyes fixed on the road ahead, mentally preparing for what lay ahead. He knew that once they reached the airport, every interaction would be scrutinized, every moment would matter. The airline staff had been briefed about the fallen soldier escort, and arrangements had been made to handle the transfer with dignity. At the airport, the atmosphere shifted immediately. The ground crew stood at attention as the hearse approached the cargo area. Marcus stepped out of the vehicle, his polished boots clicking against the asphalt as he surveyed the scene. The casket would be loaded into the cargo hold of the aircraft, but not before Marcus had a chance to say a few words and ensure everything was handled properly. The airline representatives approached with solemn expressions, understanding the gravity of the moment. However, as they began the transfer process, Marcus noticed something that made his blood run cold. A group of passengers near the boarding gate were pointing and talking loudly about the casket being loaded. Their voices carried across the tarmac, and their words were not respectful. One man was actually taking photos with his phone, treating the solemn moment like a tourist attraction. Another passenger complained loudly about potential delays, showing complete disregard for the sacrifice that David Martinez had made. Marcus felt his jaw clench as he watched this display of disrespect. These people had no idea what David had given up for them. They didn't know about the family that would never be whole again, or the dreams that would never be fulfilled. They saw only an inconvenience to their travel plans, a delay in their comfortable lives. The anger began to build in Marcus's chest, but he maintained his composure. His duty was to David, not to educate ignorant passengers. The airline staff seemed equally uncomfortable with the passengers' behavior, but they continued with their duties, loading baggage and preparing for departure. Marcus stayed close to the casket until it was properly secured in the cargo hold, offering a silent salute before the doors closed. He then made his way to the passenger boarding area, where he would take his seat and continue his vigil from above. As Marcus approached the gate, he could hear the same group of passengers still complaining about the delay. Their voices grew louder as they noticed him approaching in his dress uniform. One particularly vocal man turned to his companion and made a comment about military theatrics that was clearly intended for Marcus to hear. The soldier's hands clenched into fists at his sides, but his training and discipline held firm. The boarding process began, and Marcus was among the first to board, as was protocol for military escorts. He took his assigned seat and prepared for the flight, knowing that David was safely stowed below. The other passengers filed in gradually, and Marcus noticed that the disrespectful group from the gate had seats near the front of the aircraft. Their loud conversation continued, and they seemed oblivious to the sacred nature of the flight they were sharing. As the plane prepared for takeoff, Marcus closed his eyes and thought about David's family. He wondered how they were coping with their loss, how they would manage the funeral arrangements, and how the children would grow up without their father. These thoughts were interrupted by another loud comment from the group of passengers, this time questioning why the military wasted money on these escort flights. That was when Marcus realized that something needed to be said. These people needed to understand what was happening on their flight, what David Martinez had sacrificed, and why this escort was not just protocol, but a sacred duty. He had remained silent out of respect for his fallen comrade, but silence in the face of such disrespect was becoming unbearable. Marcus looked out the window as the plane taxied down the runway, the city growing smaller below them. Somewhere in Nebraska, a family was preparing to say goodbye to their hero. Somewhere in this very aircraft, people were treating that hero's final journey home as nothing more than an inconvenience. The contrast was stark and painful, and Marcus knew that the situation was about to change dramatically. The engines roared to life, and the aircraft lifted off into the morning sky. Below them, the landscape transformed into a patchwork of fields and cities, all part of the country that David Martinez had died protecting. Above them, passengers settled in for what they assumed would be a routine flight. But Marcus Thompson was about to make sure that this flight would be anything but routine for those who had shown such disrespect to a fallen American hero. The aircraft reached cruising altitude, and the cabin settled into the familiar rhythm of a cross-country flight. Marcus Thompson sat quietly in his window seat, his dress uniform impeccable despite the long morning. Around him, passengers had begun to relax, some reading, others working on laptops, and a few already dozing off. But the group of disrespectful passengers near the front of the plane continued their loud conversation, completely unaware that their words were carrying throughout the cabin. Marcus tried to focus on his duty, on the honor of escorting David Martinez home to his family. He thought about the briefings he had attended about David's service record. The fallen soldier had been deployed 3 times, each tour extending his commitment to protecting American interests abroad. He had volunteered for dangerous missions, saved the lives of fellow soldiers, and earned commendations for his bravery under fire. David Martinez was a genuine American hero, and he deserved better than the treatment he was receiving from these thoughtless passengers. The flight attendants moved through the cabin, offering drinks and snacks to passengers. When they reached Marcus, they spoke in hushed, respectful tones, clearly aware of his mission. Their professionalism stood in stark contrast to the behavior of the passengers who continued to treat the flight as nothing more than an inconvenience. One of the flight attendants, an older woman with kind eyes, paused beside Marcus's seat. "Thank you for your service," she whispered quietly, "and please know that we're honored to be bringing your soldier home." Marcus nodded gratefully, touched by her words. It was a reminder that not everyone was insensitive to the sacrifice being honored on this flight. There were still people who understood the cost of freedom, who recognized the debt owed to those who served. But the respectful silence was broken once again by the loud group near the front. Their complaints now focused on the quality of the airline's snacks. As the flight progressed, Marcus noticed other passengers beginning to glance toward the disruptive group with obvious annoyance. A businessman in a nearby seat shook his head in disgust at their behavior. An elderly couple exchanged concerned looks when the group's laughter became particularly loud and inappropriate. Even without knowing the full story of David Martinez's escort, the other passengers seemed to sense that something important was happening on this flight. The breaking point came when one of the disrespectful passengers, a middle-aged man in an expensive suit, began telling a crude joke that echoed throughout the cabin. His companions laughed loudly, and their voices carried over the gentle hum of the aircraft engines. Marcus felt his composure beginning to crack. This was not just about poor airline etiquette anymore. This was about basic human decency and respect for sacrifice. Marcus unbuckled his seatbelt and stood up slowly. His movement was deliberate and measured, drawing the attention of nearby passengers. His dress uniform, with its sharp creases and polished insignia, commanded immediate respect from those who saw him. As he moved toward the front of the cabin, conversations quieted and heads turned to watch his progress. The disruptive group was so engrossed in their conversation that they didn't notice Marcus approaching until he was standing directly beside their seats. The man who had been telling the crude joke looked up with a mixture of annoyance and curiosity, clearly not accustomed to being interrupted by anyone, let alone a soldier. "Excuse me," Marcus said, his voice calm but carrying the unmistakable authority of someone accustomed to command. "I need to speak with all of you." The group fell silent, unsure how to respond to this unexpected interruption. The businessman who had been leading their disrespectful conversation straightened in his seat, perhaps sensing that something significant was about to happen. The other passengers in the cabin had stopped their own conversations, creating an unusual quiet that filled the aircraft. Marcus looked each member of the group in the eye before speaking again. His training had taught him the power of silence, the importance of commanding attention before delivering a message. When he was certain that he had their complete focus, he began to speak in a voice that was clear and strong enough for the entire cabin to hear. "My name is Sergeant Marcus Thompson, and I'm escorting a fallen American hero home to his family," Marcus announced. "Staff Sergeant David Martinez is traveling with us today in the cargo hold of this aircraft. He gave his life defending the freedoms that you enjoy every day, including your freedom to speak disrespectfully about his final journey home." The impact of his words was immediate and dramatic. The disruptive passengers seemed to shrink in their seats, their faces flushing with embarrassment and shame. Around the cabin, other passengers began to understand the significance of the flight they were sharing. Some placed their hands over their hearts, others bowed their heads in respect, and a few wiped away tears that had suddenly appeared. Marcus continued, his voice steady and unwavering. "David Martinez was a father of 2 young children who will grow up without their dad. He was a husband whose wife will never again feel his embrace. He was a son whose parents will spend the rest of their lives grieving his loss. He died protecting strangers like you, people he would never meet but whose freedom he valued more than his own life." The silence in the cabin was profound now, broken only by the steady hum of the engines and the occasional sniffle from emotional passengers. The businessman who had been so vocal earlier was staring at his hands, unable to meet Marcus's gaze. His companions looked equally uncomfortable, finally understanding the magnitude of their disrespectful behavior. "This aircraft is not just a commercial flight today," Marcus explained. "It's a hearse carrying an American hero home to the people who loved him. Every passenger on this plane has the privilege of sharing in that sacred journey. I suggest you treat it with the respect it deserves." Marcus paused, allowing his words to sink in completely. The transformation in the cabin was remarkable. Passengers who had been focused on their own concerns were now thinking about David Martinez, about his family, about the sacrifice that had made their comfortable lives possible. The disruptive group sat in stunned silence, clearly grappling with the reality of their behavior. Without another word, Marcus turned and walked back to his seat, his mission accomplished. Behind him, he could hear whispered conversations beginning, but the tone was completely different now. Passengers were speaking in hushed, respectful voices, and several were asking flight attendants if there was anything they could do to honor the fallen soldier traveling with them. As Marcus settled back into his seat, he felt a sense of satisfaction that had nothing to do with personal vindication. He had done his duty, not just to David Martinez, but to the principle that heroes deserve respect, especially in their final moments of service. The cabin remained quiet for the remainder of the flight, transformed from a typical commercial journey into something approaching a flying memorial service. The transformation in the aircraft cabin was nothing short of remarkable. What had begun as a routine commercial flight filled with typical passenger chatter and complaints had become something sacred, a flying memorial that honored the ultimate sacrifice of Staff Sergeant David Martinez. Marcus Thompson returned to his seat, but the impact of his words continued to ripple throughout the cabin like stones thrown into still water. Passengers who had never given much thought to military service found themselves confronting the reality of what freedom actually cost. The businessman who had been leading the disrespectful conversation sat frozen in his seat, staring out the window at the landscape passing below. His expensive suit and confident demeanor seemed diminished now, replaced by a visible struggle with guilt and shame. His companions remained equally silent, each lost in their own thoughts about their behavior and its implications. A young mother traveling with her infant daughter found herself thinking about David Martinez's children, Emma and Jake, who would grow up without their father's guidance and protection. She held her baby closer, imagining how David's wife Sarah must be feeling at this moment, preparing to receive her husband's remains while trying to stay strong for their children. The reality of that family's loss hit her with unexpected force, bringing tears to her eyes. An elderly veteran seated several rows behind Marcus recognized the significance of what had just occurred. He had served in Vietnam and understood the weight of military sacrifice in ways that younger passengers could not. He quietly reached into his carry-on bag and pulled out a small American flag pin that he had worn on his lapel for decades. Standing slowly, he made his way to Marcus's seat and pressed the pin into the sergeant's hand without saying a word. The gesture spoke volumes about the bond between those who had served and those currently serving. The flight attendants, already aware of the fallen soldier Escort, found themselves deeply moved by Marcus's courage in addressing the disrespectful passengers. The senior flight attendant, Maria Rodriguez, had been flying for over 20 years and had witnessed many escort flights. She had never seen a military escort take such a bold stand, and she was impressed by Marcus's dignity and restraint in handling the situation. She quietly gathered her crew and they began discussing ways to honor David Martinez during the remainder of the flight. As word spread quietly through the cabin about the fallen soldier in the cargo hold, passengers began responding in their own ways. Some offered silent prayers, others simply sat in respectful contemplation. A teenager who had been playing loud music through his headphones turned off his device entirely and spent the rest of the flight reading about military service on his phone. The collective mood of the aircraft had shifted from casual indifference to somber respect. The businessman who had been so disruptive earlier finally found the courage to approach Marcus. His face was flushed with embarrassment as he stopped beside the sergeant's seat, struggling to find appropriate words. His voice was barely above a whisper when he finally spoke, clearly aware that other passengers were watching his attempt at redemption. "Sergeant Thompson," he began, his earlier arrogance completely absent. "I want to apologize for my behavior. I had no idea. I should have known better regardless. But..." He struggled with the words, his corporate confidence failing him completely in the face of genuine remorse. Marcus looked up at the man, seeing not the arrogant passenger from earlier, but a human being confronting his own shortcomings. The sergeant's response was measured and dignified, reflecting the military values of honor and integrity that had guided his actions throughout the flight. "Apology accepted," Marcus said simply. "But David Martinez is the one who deserves your respect, not me. He's the hero on this flight." The businessman nodded gratefully, clearly moved by Marcus's grace in accepting his apology. He returned to his seat, but the encounter had changed something fundamental in his understanding of service and sacrifice. For the first time in years, he found himself thinking about something larger than his own immediate concerns and business interests. As the flight continued toward its destination in Nebraska, the cabin maintained its respectful atmosphere. Conversations remained hushed and passengers seemed more aware of their fellow travelers. The usual complaints about airline food, seating arrangements, and flight delays were notably absent. Instead, people seemed to be reflecting on larger questions about duty, sacrifice, and the cost of the freedoms they enjoyed. A college student traveling home for semester break found herself researching military service programs on her laptop. She had never seriously considered the military as a career option, but Marcus's words about David Martinez's sacrifice had planted a seed of curiosity about serving something greater than herself. She made a mental note to visit her campus military recruiter when she returned to school. The pilot, Captain Jennifer Walsh, had been monitoring the situation through reports from her flight crew. She had flown many escort flights during her career and understood the sacred nature of these journeys. Moved by Marcus's courage and the passenger response, she made an unprecedented decision to address the entire cabin over the intercom system. "Ladies and gentlemen, this is your captain speaking." Her voice came through the cabin speakers with unusual solemnity. "We are honored today to be bringing home Staff Sergeant David Martinez, an American hero who made the ultimate sacrifice in service to our country. We ask that you join us in a moment of silence to honor his memory and express our gratitude for his service." The cabin fell completely silent as passengers and crew members observed the moment of remembrance. Even the constant background noise of the aircraft seemed muted during those precious seconds of collective respect. When Captain Walsh broke the silence to announce their approach to the Nebraska airport, her voice carried a reverence that elevated the routine announcement into something approaching a benediction. As the aircraft began its descent, Marcus prepared for the next phase of his duties. Upon landing, he would oversee the transfer of David Martinez's remains to the waiting hearse and accompany the fallen soldier to the funeral home, where his family would begin their final farewell. The responsibilities weighed heavily on his shoulders, but he felt strengthened by the respect and support he had witnessed from his fellow passengers. The disruptive businessman approached Marcus one final time before landing, this time with a business card and a sincere request. He asked for information about military support organizations, explaining that he wanted to make a substantial donation in David Martinez's honor. His transformation from thoughtless passenger to concerned citizen represented the kind of change that Marcus had hoped to inspire with his courageous stand. As the wheels touched down on the Nebraska runway, Marcus Thompson knew that this flight had been about much more than simply transporting a fallen soldier home. It had become a powerful reminder that heroes deserve honor, that sacrifice should be respected, and that sometimes courage means speaking up for those who can no longer speak for themselves. The aircraft rolled to a gentle stop at the Nebraska airport terminal, but the usual rush to disembark was notably absent. Passengers remained in their seats, sensing that this arrival was different from any they had experienced before. The cabin was filled with a respectful silence that seemed to acknowledge the sacred cargo resting in the hold below. Marcus Thompson gathered his belongings slowly, knowing that his most important duties were yet to come. Captain Jennifer Walsh's voice came over the intercom one final time, her words carrying the weight of the moment. "Ladies and gentlemen, we ask that you please remain seated while we honor Staff Sergeant David Martinez with a dignified transfer. Military personnel and ground crew will be handling this process, and we appreciate your patience and continued respect during this solemn procedure." Through the aircraft windows, passengers could see the honor guard assembling on the tarmac. 6 soldiers in dress uniforms had formed 2 precise lines leading from the cargo hold to a waiting hearse. The Nebraska National Guard had provided the honor detail, and their crisp movements and solemn expressions reflected the gravity of their duty. American flags flew at half-staff around the airport, and ground crew members had removed their caps in respect. Marcus rose from his seat and began moving toward the front of the aircraft. As he passed each row, passengers looked up at him with expressions of respect and gratitude. The businessman who had been so disruptive earlier stood as Marcus approached, extending his hand in a gesture of respect. Their handshake was brief but meaningful, representing a bridge between 2 very different worlds brought together by the sacrifice of David Martinez. "Thank you for your service, Sergeant," the businessman said quietly, "and thank you for helping me understand what this day really means." Marcus nodded and continued toward the exit, where the flight crew waited to see him off. Maria Rodriguez, the senior flight attendant, spoke for the entire crew when she thanked him for his dignity and courage during the flight. Her words reflected the profound impact that his actions had made on everyone aboard the aircraft. As Marcus stepped onto the jetway, he could feel the weight of responsibility settling on his shoulders once again. The transformation that had occurred during the flight was remarkable, but now he had to focus on the final phase of his mission. David Martinez deserved a flawless transfer, one that would honor his service and provide some measure of comfort to the family waiting at the funeral home. The ground crew had cordoned off the area around the cargo hold, creating a respectful space for the transfer ceremony. Airport employees stood at attention along the route that the honor guard would follow, their presence adding to the solemnity of the moment. Even the typical noise and bustle of airport operations seemed muted, as if the entire facility was paying its respects to the fallen soldier. Marcus joined the honor guard as they prepared to receive David Martinez's flag-draped casket. The precision of their movements was a testament to their training and their understanding of the significance of their duty. Each soldier knew that they were participating in a sacred ritual, one that honored not just David Martinez but all those who had made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country. Inside the aircraft, passengers pressed against windows to witness the transfer ceremony. Many were moved to tears by the dignity and respect being shown to the fallen soldier. The businessman who had been so transformed by Marcus's words found himself explaining the significance of the ceremony to his young daughter, who was traveling with him. His words carried a reverence that would have been impossible just hours earlier. The cargo hold doors opened, and the honor guard moved into position. 6 soldiers carefully lifted the flag-draped casket, their movements synchronized and respectful. As they emerged from the cargo hold, they began the slow, measured march toward the waiting hearse. Each step was deliberate, each movement calculated to honor the hero they carried. Marcus walked alongside the honor guard, his presence representing the continuous protection that David Martinez had received throughout his journey home. The sergeant's dress uniform was impeccable, his bearing proud and dignified. He understood that he was not just escorting remains, but ensuring that a hero received the honor he deserved until the very moment he was reunited with his family. The ceremony attracted attention from other areas of the airport. Travelers in the terminal pressed against windows to watch the procession, many removing their hats or placing their hands over their hearts. TSA agents, airline employees, and maintenance workers stopped their activities to pay their respects. The entire airport seemed to pause in recognition of the sacrifice being honored on their grounds. As the honor guard reached the hearse, they carefully loaded David Martinez's casket into the vehicle. Marcus performed a final inspection, ensuring that everything was properly secured and that the flag remained perfectly positioned. His attention to detail reflected not just military precision, but a personal commitment to the fallen soldier and his family. The driver of the hearse was a veteran himself, a man who understood the significance of his role in this final journey. His funeral home had handled many military services over the years, and he took pride in providing dignity and respect to fallen heroes and their families. As Marcus climbed into the passenger seat, the driver offered a simple nod of acknowledgement between those who served. Behind them, passengers were finally beginning to disembark from the aircraft, but their departure was subdued and respectful. Many lingered in the terminal, watching through windows as the hearse prepared to leave. The businessman approached one of the airport customer service representatives and asked about the process for making donations to military family support organizations. His transformation was complete, and his desire to honor David Martinez would extend far beyond this single day. The young mother with the infant daughter found herself researching ways to support military families in her community. The college student made contact with her campus Veterans Services office, beginning a conversation about service opportunities that might allow her to give back to those who had sacrificed so much. The elderly veteran who had given Marcus his flag pin remained in the terminal long after his connecting flight was called, spending time in quiet reflection about his own service and the continuing sacrifice of younger generations. As the hearse pulled away from the airport, Marcus felt a sense of completion regarding the flight portion of his mission. The disrespectful passengers had been transformed into respectful citizens. The entire cabin had been united in honoring David Martinez, and the transfer had been conducted with perfect dignity. But his duties were far from over, as the most emotionally challenging part of his mission still lay ahead. The drive to the funeral home would take them through small Nebraska towns and rural communities where American flags flew from porches and businesses. Word had spread about the fallen soldier's return, and people had gathered along the route to pay their respects. Children held small flags, veterans saluted, and families stood in solemn recognition of the sacrifice being honored by the passing hearse. Marcus watched the landscape roll by, thinking about David Martinez's final journey home and the family that would soon receive their hero. The courage he had shown on the aircraft seemed small compared to the courage that David's family would need in the days and years ahead. But Marcus took comfort in knowing that the flight had honored David's memory and perhaps inspired others to appreciate the true cost of freedom. The hearse moved slowly through the Nebraska countryside, carrying Staff Sergeant David Martinez on his final journey home. Marcus Thompson sat in respectful silence beside the funeral director, watching as small communities came together to honor a hero they had never met, but whose sacrifice they deeply understood. American flags lined the route, held by children, veterans, and families who had heard about the fallen soldier's return and wanted to pay their respects. In the small town of Fairfield, the local VFW post had organized an impromptu honor ceremony. Veterans in their dress uniforms stood at attention along Main Street, their salutes crisp despite their advanced age. Many of these men had served in Korea, Vietnam, and Desert Storm, and they recognized the sacred nature of the procession passing through their community. Their presence represented an unbroken chain of service and sacrifice that connected David Martinez to generations of American heroes. Sarah Martinez waited at the funeral home with her children, Emma and Jake. The 6-year-old girl clutched a small American flag that her father had given her before his last deployment, while 8-year-old Jake tried to be strong for his mother and sister. Sarah's parents had driven in from Iowa to provide support, and David's battle buddies from his unit had arrived to serve as pallbearers. The gathering represented the extended military family that rallied around its members during times of crisis and loss. As the hearse approached the funeral home, Marcus prepared himself for the most emotionally challenging part of his mission. Meeting the family of a fallen soldier was always difficult, but it was also one of the most important aspects of the escort duty. He would need to convey the respect and honor that David had received throughout his journey home, while also providing some measure of comfort to those who loved him most. The funeral home parking lot was filled with vehicles as members of the community gathered to welcome David home. Local law enforcement had provided a motorcycle escort for the final miles, and firefighters from 3 departments had positioned their trucks along the route, with extended ladders displaying large American flags. The outpouring of support reflected the deep respect that rural Nebraska communities held for their military families. Marcus stepped out of the hearse and immediately noticed Sarah Martinez standing near the entrance to the funeral home. She was a small woman with kind eyes that reflected both profound grief and remarkable strength. Beside her stood her children, both dressed in their best clothes and holding small flags. The sight of David's family brought home the full reality of the sacrifice that had brought them all together. The honor guard from the local National Guard unit had assembled to receive David's remains and transfer them into the funeral home. Their movements were precise and respectful, reflecting hours of practice and a deep understanding of their duty. Marcus coordinated with the guard commander to ensure that the transfer would be conducted with perfect dignity, worthy of the hero they were honoring. As the honor guard carefully removed David's flag-draped casket from the hearse, a profound silence fell over the assembled crowd. Veterans saluted, civilians placed their hands over their hearts, and children stood quietly beside their parents. The only sounds were the gentle Nebraska wind and the measured footsteps of the honor guard as they carried David toward the funeral home. Entrance. Sarah Martinez approached Marcus as the honor guard completed their duties. Her voice was steady despite her obvious grief, reflecting the strength that military families develop during repeated deployments and separations. She thanked Marcus for bringing her husband home safely and asked about his journey. Her questions were simple but profound, seeking connection with the final phase of David's service. Marcus explained to Sarah about the flight and the transformation that had occurred among the passengers. He told her about the businessman who had been disrespectful, but was changed by learning about David's sacrifice. He described the moment of silence that the captain had requested, and the honor that all the passengers had shown once they understood the significance of their journey. His words brought comfort to Sarah, knowing that her husband's final trip had been treated with dignity and respect. Young Emma Martinez shyly approached Marcus and asked if she could give him something for her daddy. From her small purse, she pulled out a hand-drawn picture showing a soldier in uniform with a big smile and the words, "I love you, Daddy," written in careful first-grade handwriting. Her innocent gesture brought tears to the eyes of everyone present, including the stoic honor guard members who had witnessed many military funerals, but were still moved by the pure love of a child for her father. Jake Martinez, trying to be the man of the family at 8 years old, shook Marcus's hand with solemn dignity. He had been asking difficult questions about his father's death and was struggling to understand why good people had to die. Marcus knelt down to speak with the boy at eye level, explaining that his father had been a true hero who had protected people he didn't even know because he believed in doing what was right. The gathering at the funeral home continued as friends. Family and community members came to pay their respects to David Martinez and support his family. Stories were shared about David's life, his service, and his devotion to his family. Marcus listened to these stories and began to understand the full measure of the man whose final journey he had protected. David's commanding officer, Colonel Rebecca Hayes, had flown in from the base to attend the services and speak with the family. She described David's exceptional service record, his bravery under fire, and his dedication to his fellow soldiers. Her words painted a picture of a man who had lived his values every day, both in military service and in his personal life. The local pastor, Reverend Michael Thompson, approached Marcus to discuss the funeral service that would take place the following day. The entire community was expected to attend, and special arrangements had been made to accommodate the large crowd anticipated. The church had received calls from people hundreds of miles away who wanted to attend and honor David's memory, reflecting the impact that his story had made throughout the region. As evening approached, Marcus prepared to take his leave from the family. His official duties were complete, but the connections he had made during this mission would last far longer than the formal escort assignment. Sarah Martinez asked him to stay for the funeral service if his duties permitted, and Marcus gratefully accepted the invitation. That night, Marcus stayed at a local hotel and reflected on the events of the past day. The disrespectful passengers who had been transformed by learning about David's sacrifice, the honor guard ceremonies, and the gathering of community support all represented the best of American values. David Martinez had continued to serve his country even in death, inspiring others to appreciate the true cost of freedom. The businessman from the flight had called the funeral home and arranged for a substantial donation to a scholarship fund being established in David's name. His transformation from thoughtless passenger to committed supporter represented the kind of change that Marcus had hoped to inspire with his courageous stand on the aircraft. The ripple effects of that moment of moral courage would continue to spread far beyond the confines of the airplane cabin. As Marcus prepared for sleep, he thought about the funeral service that would take place the next day and the final farewell that David Martinez would receive from his community. The escort mission had been completed successfully, but the true measure of its impact would be seen in the lives that had been touched and changed by David's story of service and sacrifice. The morning of David Martinez's funeral dawned clear and bright across Nebraska, as if nature itself was paying tribute to the fallen hero. Marcus Thompson arrived early at the church, where volunteers and military personnel were making final preparations for what would be one of the largest funeral services in the community's history. American flags lined the streets leading to the church, and veterans from across the state had traveled to honor one of their own. Inside the church, the atmosphere was both solemn and celebratory, reflecting a community's desire to honor David's life while mourning his loss. The sanctuary was filled with flowers, military honors, and photographs depicting David's life from childhood through his military service. Sarah Martinez sat in the front row with Emma and Jake, surrounded by family members who had traveled from across the country to pay their respects. The businessman from the flight, Robert Chen, had made the 4-hour drive from his home in Denver to attend the service. He sat quietly in the back of the church, still processing the transformation he had experienced during the flight. His presence represented something profound about the power of education and understanding to change hearts and minds. He had brought his teenage daughter with him, wanting her to understand the real meaning of service and sacrifice. Marcus took his place with the military honor guard, but his role today extended beyond official duties. He had become part of David's story, a guardian of his memory and a witness to the impact that one soldier's sacrifice could have on countless lives. The connections formed during the escort mission had created bonds that would last far beyond this final ceremony. Reverend Thompson began the service with words that captured both the grief of loss and the pride of honor. He spoke about David as a husband, father, son, and soldier, painting a complete picture of a man who had lived his values in every aspect of his life. The pastor's words brought comfort to the family while challenging the congregation to consider their own contributions to the community and country that David had died. Protecting Colonel Hayes delivered the military tribute, describing David's exceptional service record and the respect he had earned from his fellow soldiers. She read citations for his various commendations and described specific instances of courage and leadership that had marked his military career. Her words transformed the abstract concept of heroism into the concrete reality of a man who had repeatedly chosen duty over safety. The most powerful moment of the service came when Sarah Martinez approached the podium to speak about her husband. Her voice was strong despite her obvious grief, and her words painted a picture of David as a devoted family man who had struggled with the decision to deploy, but ultimately chose to serve because he believed in protecting others. She thanked the community for their support and specifically mentioned Marcus Thompson and the dignity with which David had been escorted home. Young, Jake Martinez surprised everyone by asking to speak about his father. The 8-year-old boy stood at the podium with remarkable composure and spoke about the lessons his father had taught him about courage, kindness, and standing up for what was right. His innocent words about wanting to be a soldier like his daddy brought tears to every eye in the sanctuary and provided a glimpse into the lasting legacy that David's sacrifice would have on future generations. The service concluded with the playing of taps and the presentation of the flag to Sarah Martinez. The honor guard performed the flag-folding ceremony with precision and dignity, their movements representing traditions that connected David's sacrifice to generations of American military service. As the folded flag was placed in Sarah's hands, the weight of her loss and the honor of her husband's service converged in a moment of profound emotion. The procession to the cemetery stretched for miles, with hundreds of vehicles following the hearse through the Nebraska countryside. Along the route, families stood outside their homes with flags and signs honoring David's memory. Children who had been dismissed early from school lined portions of the route, their small flags creating a sea of red, white, and blue that would remain in Marcus's memory forever. At the cemetery, the final military honors were conducted with perfect precision. The honor guard fired their rifle salute, taps echoed across the rolling hills, and David Martinez was laid to rest among other veterans who had served their country with distinction. Marcus stood at attention throughout the ceremony, completing his final duty as David's escort and guardian. After the burial, the community gathered at the church fellowship hall for a meal and continued remembrance. Stories were shared, tears were shed, and connections were made that would support the Martinez family in the years ahead. Robert Chen, the businessman from the flight, established the David Martinez Memorial Scholarship with an initial donation of $50,000, ensuring that David's legacy would help other young people pursue their educational dreams. Marcus spent time with David's military unit, sharing stories and providing closure for soldiers who had lost a brother in arms. These conversations were difficult but necessary, allowing the unit to process their grief while honoring David's memory. The bonds formed through shared service and sacrifice created a support network that would sustain them through their own deployments and challenges. As the day concluded, Marcus prepared to return to his base and resume his regular duties. But the impact of the escort mission would stay with him forever. He had witnessed the power of standing up for what was right, the importance of honoring sacrifice, and the capacity of ordinary people to rise to extraordinary moments when challenged to do so. Sarah Martinez approached Marcus one final time before his departure, thanking him not just for bringing David home safely, but for ensuring that his final journey had been treated with the dignity and respect he deserved. She gave him a small flag that had been displayed at David's memorial service, asking him to remember her husband and the family that would continue to honor his memory. The drive back to the airport gave Marcus time to reflect on the remarkable journey that had begun with a routine escort assignment and evolved into something much more significant. The disrespectful passengers who had been transformed, the community that had rallied around a fallen hero, and the family that had found strength in honoring their loved one's service all represented the best of American values and character. 6 months later, Marcus received a letter from Robert Chen describing the scholarship recipients and the positive impact that David's story had made on his own family's understanding of service and sacrifice. The businessman had begun volunteering with veterans organizations and had become an advocate for military families in his community. His transformation from thoughtless passenger to committed supporter demonstrated the lasting power of education and moral courage. Marcus Thompson's courageous stand on that aircraft had honored not just David Martinez, but all those who had made the ultimate sacrifice in service to their country. His actions reminded everyone present that heroes deserve respect, that sacrifice should be remembered, and that sometimes the most important battles are fought not with weapons, but with words spoken in defense of honor and dignity. The fallen soldier's escort had become something much more than a military duty. It had become a powerful reminder of the values that make America worth defending.